It was a quiet evening when Jeremiah King's world was torn apart. His daughter Alyssa was the light of his life, smart, strong, and filled with dreams. But when the police raided his home targeting the wrong house, that night changed everything. What happened next would leave you speechless. A fatal mistake, a young girl's life lost. What do you do when the ones sworn to protect you are the ones who hurt you? Stay tuned because what happens next will shock you. Before we dive into this shocking story, where are you watching from? Drop a comment below, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more jaw-dropping real-life stories. Trust me, this one is going to make you think twice. It was a cold winter night. The kind of night where the moonlight barely managed to break through the thick clouds that rolled across the sky. The air was crisp, the kind of cold that nipped at the skin, even through layers of clothes. But for Jeremiah King, a black father of two, tonight wasn't just cold. It was the night his world was about to be shattered. He sat in his living room, the dim light from the television flickering as he absent-mindedly watched a news segment about a recent police raid that had gone wrong in another neighborhood. His daughter Alyssa was next to him, her head resting on his shoulder. She had fallen asleep after a long day of studying for her upcoming exams. Jeremiah smiled softly as he watched her, proud of how hard she worked despite everything they'd been through. Alyssa had always been his brightest light, full of life, of potential, and he had vowed to protect her, no matter what. The night was supposed to be peaceful, quiet, but outside, in the cold, a convoy of police cars rolled up to the curb, their lights flashing. The loud rumble of engines seemed to echo louder than it should, like a growing storm threatening to break. There was a sudden urgency to the movement outside, the sound of boots hitting the pavement, the clink of weapons being readied. Jeremiah didn't notice at first. The noise was faint, until it wasn't. A loud bang at the front door jolted him out of his thoughts. He stood up immediately, heart racing. "What the hell?" he muttered, his hand instinctively reaching for his phone. He glanced at Alyssa, whose peaceful expression was replaced with a frown of confusion as she stirred awake. "Daddy, what's going on?" she asked groggily, rubbing her eyes. Jeremiah barely had time to respond. Another bang, this time louder, more urgent, resonated through the walls. Before he could process what was happening, the door was smashed open. The force of it seemed unnatural, as though the world outside had just come crashing in. He barely had time to react. "Police, get on the ground!" a harsh voice shouted, the words full of anger and authority. Jeremiah's heart skipped a beat. He couldn't see who was speaking, but the force of the intrusion was unmistakable. The officers had stormed in without warning, their guns raised, their flashlights blinding as they pointed them at him and his daughter. He froze, his mind racing for a moment to comprehend the situation. But before he could say a word, one of the officers shoved him down to the floor, hard, his hands forced behind his back. Alyssa screamed, "Get down now!" One officer shouted, pushing her towards the ground as well. Jeremiah tried to get up to protect his daughter, but he was held down by two officers who seemed to enjoy the force they applied. The more they pressed him down, the more panic began to settle in. What was happening? Why were they raiding his home? Why was his daughter being forced to the floor? What is this? Jeremiah stammered, barely able to speak. But the officers didn't answer. Instead, they began to search the house, kicking open doors, throwing things aside, clearly looking for something, anything to justify their raid. Alyssa cried out, trying to cover her head, her hands trembling. Jeremiah turned his head to the officer closest to him, his voice rising. "You've got the wrong house. What's this about? Why are you doing this to us?" One officer's eyes narrowed, and he sneered. "You're not in a position to ask questions, pal. You're just in the way." Jeremiah's heart pounded in his chest. What was going on? He had no criminal record, no history of violence. He was just a man who had worked hard to provide for his family. He had no idea why they were here. Another loud bang came from the back of the house, followed by shuffling. The officers were everywhere, rummaging through the rooms with no care for the belongings they tossed aside. A few minutes later, they finally pulled him up off the floor. "You need to come with us," the officer barked, his grip harsh on Jeremiah's arm. "And keep quiet." Jeremiah opened his mouth to protest, but before he could speak, he heard a voice, the voice of a woman who had just entered the room. "Wait, what the hell is going on here?" It was Alyssa, standing up in her pajamas, her eyes wide with fear. Her voice cracked, but there was no mistaking her disbelief. Jeremiah's heart dropped. He knew that voice. She had seen everything. She had seen them break down their door and throw her father to the ground. One of the officers turned to Alyssa, a look of contempt in his eyes. "Stay back," he snapped. But Alyssa didn't listen. With a look of defiance, she stepped forward, her voice strong despite the terror. "Who are you to come into our home like this? What is happening?" The officer raised his gun at her, his finger just grazing the trigger. "No, don't hurt her," Jeremiah shouted, his voice desperate, but the officer didn't hesitate. He pulled the trigger. The gunshot rang through the house with a deafening crack, and everything seemed to stop. Alyssa's body went limp, her legs buckling beneath her as she collapsed to the floor. The world around her turned into a blur of chaos, sound, and confusion. For a moment, Jeremiah didn't move, his mind refusing to register what had just happened. It wasn't real. It couldn't be. His daughter, his precious daughter, wasn't supposed to be hurt. Not like this. Not by those who were meant to protect. "Alyssa," Jeremiah cried, his voice breaking as he struggled against the officers who still held him down. His body fought to move, to get to her, but the hands on him were like iron. The officer who had fired the shot stood frozen, his gun still aimed at the floor, his hand trembling. He had clearly acted on instinct, a momentary slip, but it felt as if the entire room had turned to ice. The officer hadn't meant to kill, but his actions spoke a different language. The damage had been done. Jeremiah's mind raced, but his instincts took over. Alyssa was his daughter. He had to get to her. He had to know if she was okay. But as he tried to move, one of the officers slapped his hand back down. "Stay down." The officer barked, his tone harsh, but there was no force behind it. He was just as shaken as the others, but Jeremiah didn't care. All he cared about was Alyssa, his baby. He wrenched himself free from the officer's grip, pushing with every ounce of strength he had left. The world around him blurred, and the weight of the officer's commands was nothing compared to the fear and urgency in his chest. He knew that if he didn't get to her, he would lose her forever. He crawled. The officers watched, some of them hesitant, some unsure of how to respond, but none of them made a move to stop him. Jeremiah reached Alyssa's side. She was lying on the floor, her body curled in on itself. His heart broke as he saw the blood pooling around her waist, a dark stain on the light blue of her pajamas. She wasn't moving, her eyes closed, her chest still. "Alyssa," Jeremiah whispered, his voice raw and panicked. He leaned over her, his hands trembling as he gently touched her face. There was no response. His heart threatened to stop. The officer who had fired the shot approached cautiously, his eyes wide with guilt. I didn't mean," he began, but his voice trailed off. He was too late. He could offer no explanation for the horror he had just caused. "You didn't mean it?" Jeremiah growled, his voice thick with anger and despair. "Does she look like she doesn't mean it? My daughter is lying here because of you." Another officer stepped forward, his face pale and filled with shock. "Sir, we'll call an ambulance right now. We'll get her help." "Help?" Jeremiah spat. "It's too late for help. You've already taken her from me." The officers fidgeted, unsure of what to do next. Their mission, their raid, was now irrelevant. The reality of the mistake they had made hit them hard, and the weight of their actions settled heavily in the room. But Jeremiah didn't care about their confusion or their remorse. He was done with the apologies. He was done with being the victim, the scapegoat. A moment passed in tense silence, and then Jeremiah heard it, the sound of sirens wailing in the distance, drawing nearer. It was too late to undo the tragedy. Alyssa had already paid the price for the officer's mistakes. Jeremiah's emotions crashed into him like a wave. He had known that the world wasn't kind to people like him. A black man, a father in a world that often saw him as less than human. He had grown used to the looks, the assumptions, the unfair treatment. But never had he imagined that his daughter, the one thing he loved most, would become another victim of an unjust system. As the sirens grew louder, one of the officers took a step back, reaching for his radio. But Jeremiah wasn't interested in the paramedics or the police investigation that was surely going to unfold. The only thing he cared about was Alyssa, and it was clear, even as he held her in his arms, that he was too late to save her. She had been taken from him in the blink of an eye, by a careless mistake, a racist mistake. What now? Jeremiah wondered. What could he do in the face of such senseless violence? His heart thudded in his chest. He had to make them pay for what they had done. They had taken his daughter, and in doing so they had stolen his peace. But he knew that revenge would not bring Alyssa back. No matter what happened next, nothing would ever be the same. The world had just changed forever for him. As the sound of sirens grew louder, the officers began to back off, but their guilt was evident in their expressions. The reality of their actions was dawning on them, but it would never be enough. The ambulance arrived mere minutes after the sirens, but it was already too late. Alyssa's body remained lifeless, her chest no longer rising with breath. The paramedics worked quickly, trying to revive her, but the blood loss had been too much. The bullet had hit her side, rupturing something vital. It wasn't the first time a life had been taken in a police mishap, but it was the first time that Jeremiah King had been caught in the heart of it. He watched helplessly as the paramedics did their best to bring her back. His heart was breaking, his mind screaming for this nightmare to stop. There were no more words to say, just the cold reality of watching them try to resuscitate his daughter as the officers in the room stood in stunned silence. One of the paramedics, a woman in her 30s, looked up at him with sorrow in her eyes. She didn't need to say anything for him to understand. They had failed. Alyssa was gone. For a moment, time seemed to stretch, the world slowing down. The noise of the sirens, the officers' murmurs, the footsteps of the paramedics, it all felt distant, as though the universe had frozen to honor the tragic loss. Jeremiah didn't know what to do with himself, how to process the immense weight of the grief pressing down on him. But as he stood there, the reality of what had happened began to settle in. Alyssa, his precious daughter, had been killed in a senseless act of violence. He had no answers, just questions that swirled in his mind. Why her? Why did they raid his house? Why hadn't the officers been more careful? Was it just another case of mistaken identity? Or was it the result of something deeper, racism that had long been embedded in the system? One officer approached him hesitantly, his face filled with guilt and confusion. "Sir, we didn't mean for this to happen," the officer said, his voice trembling. But Jeremiah wasn't interested in their excuses. He had already seen enough. He had already witnessed their mistakes, their carelessness, and their disregard for human life. "You didn't mean for this to happen?" Jeremiah's voice was low, almost a growl. "My daughter's dead. Does it matter what you meant? She's gone, and nothing you say can bring her back." The officer stepped back, his face paling at the anger in Jeremiah's voice, but Jeremiah wasn't done. He couldn't stop. His emotions, his rage were overwhelming. "You stormed into my home, pointed your guns at me, at my daughter, and you didn't even care to check your facts. You didn't even care to ask if you had the right house. What's that supposed to mean?" The officer didn't respond. He couldn't. He wasn't prepared for the fire that burned in Jeremiah's words. He was just another pawn in a system that had failed him, failed his daughter. Jeremiah turned away, his hands shaking as he wiped his eyes. There was no comfort here, no moment of solace. His daughter was gone, and the weight of the injustice was suffocating him. The officers stood in silence, unsure of what to do next. They had entered his home with force and intimidation, believing they were in control of the situation, but now they stood paralyzed, realizing the damage they had caused. Hours later, after the police had taken a statement from Jeremiah and the authorities had begun their investigation, he found himself standing in front of the small white cross they had placed in the front yard. The evening air was colder than before, biting into his skin, but he barely felt it. He was numb, shattered by what had just happened. He couldn't understand how something like this could happen. He had trusted the police, he had believed in the system, but now, all he saw were people who thought they had the right to enter his home without reason, to point their guns at him and his daughter, and to take her life because of their own mistakes. His heart was broken, but it wasn't just for Alyssa. It was for everyone who had ever been affected by this kind of injustice, the countless others who had suffered at the hands of the police. The following day, news outlets began reporting on the tragedy, and the story quickly made headlines across the city. "Racist police raid ends in tragedy as Black father loses daughter," one headline read. The media buzzed with the story, but Jeremiah couldn't bring himself to care about their sensational headlines. His focus was on one thing: justice. The images of that night, the officers raiding his home, the sound of his daughter's scream, the look of disbelief on her face as she fell to the ground haunted him. But now, as the investigation began, he knew it was time to do something about it. He couldn't let her death be swept under the rug. He couldn't let this become just another statistic in a system designed to erase people like him. As the days passed, Jeremiah's resolve hardened. He would not stay silent. He would not let his daughter's death become just another tragic mistake in a long line of police misconduct. He would fight. He would make them hear his voice. The investigation, though slow, was gaining momentum. There were talks of a trial, of the officers involved being held accountable for their actions. But Jeremiah knew that true justice was about more than just accountability. It was about changing the system that had allowed this to happen in the first place. And so he began to gather his strength, preparing for the next battle. The road ahead was going to be long and difficult, but for Alyssa, for all the others who had suffered like she had, he would make sure their voices were heard. The news of Alyssa's death spread quickly, and soon the entire city was talking about it. Protests erupted outside police headquarters, demanding accountability for the tragic mistake. Jeremiah King, once just another quiet citizen trying to live his life, was now the face of a movement, a father whose world had been ripped apart by a racist police system that had taken his daughter. Jeremiah spent the following weeks fighting back against the whirlwind of media attention, not because he wanted it, but because he knew it was his only chance to make sure Alyssa's death wasn't forgotten. He met with activists, lawyers, and civil rights leaders who rallied behind his cause, all promising that they would hold the police responsible. But every meeting, every conversation about reform, felt empty. They promised him justice, but Jeremiah knew better than to trust empty promises. He had lived long enough to know that real change didn't come from meetings and discussions. It came from action, and the action was needed now more than ever. The police department, meanwhile, began to mount their defense. Officer Peter Carlson, the one who had fired the fatal shot, was placed on administrative leave pending investigation, but Emily Wells, the officer who had led the raid, remained in her position, continuing to sit comfortably at her desk, protected by her position in the department. The internal investigation had already begun, but the discomfort Jeremiah felt only deepened with every passing day. It wasn't about the officers. It was about the system that had allowed them to act this way in the first place. As public outrage continued to grow, Jeremiah was approached by a local news reporter, Rebecca Turner, who had been covering the protests and police misconduct in the city for years. She had seen this kind of tragedy before, families broken apart by the same cycle of violence and ignorance. But this time, something was different. This wasn't just another story for her to cover. It was a personal challenge. She saw Jeremiah as a man who had already been through so much and who would not let his daughter's death fade into obscurity. "We need to do more than just talk about it, Mr. King," Rebecca said as they sat down in his living room, the sound of protesters chanting outside his window growing louder by the hour. "This story is bigger than just a tragic mistake. It's about what we as a society are willing to accept, and we need you to help us tell that." Jeremiah looked at her, unsure at first. He wasn't sure if he was ready to put himself under the microscope again, but something in Rebecca's eyes told him that this wasn't just another news piece. This was her fight too. "I don't want this to be just another headline," Jeremiah said slowly, the weight of his daughter's memory heavy in his chest. "I want them to know that this was my daughter, a life cut short by a system that's broken." Rebecca nodded. "We're not going to let them forget, not this time." A few days later, Jeremiah agreed to speak publicly about Alyssa's death. He sat in front of the cameras, his eyes clear and focused. His voice, though soft, carried the weight of everything he had gone through. As he spoke, the truth poured out about how his daughter had been innocent, about how the raid had been a mistake, and about how he had been targeted by a system that wasn't built to protect him, but to break him. "It's easy for people to look at me and see a man with a disability, a man who's just trying to survive in this world," Jeremiah said, his voice strong now. "But I'm not just surviving. I'm fighting. I'm fighting for my daughter. I'm fighting for every black father who's been told they don't belong. And I'm fighting for justice." As the interview aired, the world was forced to listen. The images of Jeremiah's quiet grief, the raw emotion on his face, and the strength in his voice began to stir the public in ways they hadn't anticipated. His words were not just those of a father. They were the words of a man who had lost everything, and yet still stood tall. But even as the public rallied behind him, Jeremiah could feel the walls closing in. The investigation was dragging, and the police were trying to turn the narrative around. They were claiming the raid had been necessary, that the officers had acted in self-defense, that Alyssa's death was unavoidable. The media began to divide, with some reports sympathizing with the officers, questioning the legitimacy of the protesters, and others rallying for reform. One night, as Jeremiah sat in his living room, staring at the small shrine they had set up for Alyssa, he received a call from one of the top defense lawyers in the city. The lawyer was representing the police, and he was making an offer. "We'd like to offer you a settlement, Mr. King," the lawyer said, his voice smooth but distant. "In exchange for dropping the charges, we're willing to compensate you for your loss." The offer was generous, at least on paper, but for Jeremiah, it was an insult. How could they put a price on the life of his daughter? How could they believe that a settlement would fix the brokenness he felt in his soul? "No amount of money will bring her back," Jeremiah replied, his voice calm but cold, "and I'll never stop until those responsible for her death are held accountable." The lawyer was quiet for a moment before replying, "Then you'll have a fight on your hands, but we're prepared to go all the way, Mr. King." Jeremiah hung up the phone, the weight of what he had just heard sinking in. He had just been offered a chance to end this, to walk away. But he couldn't, not when the stakes were this high. Alyssa deserved justice, and he was going to make sure she got it. The days following the phone call from the defense lawyer were a blur for Jeremiah King. The weight of his decision to keep fighting for justice for Alyssa grew heavier each day. He had faced every kind of obstacle imaginable: the police department's resistance, the media spin, and even his own doubts about whether this battle would ever be won. But through it all, one thought kept him grounded. Alyssa's life mattered, and her death would not be swept under the rug. As the legal battle unfolded, the world watched. Protests continued to grow, and voices from across the country rallied behind Jeremiah. But the fight had become more than just about one man and one family. It had become a symbol of the systemic failures that plagued so many communities. The people's calls for justice rang louder than the government's defense. But the hardest part of the fight still lay ahead: the trial. Officer Peter Carlson, the officer who had fired the fatal shot, was finally going to stand trial for his actions. The courtroom was packed with reporters, activists, and the families of others who had suffered from similar injustices. Jeremiah sat in the front row, his eyes fixed on the man who had taken his daughter from him. There was no anger in his gaze anymore, only a quiet, unwavering resolve. He wasn't here to make the world feel sorry for him. He was here for justice, and that meant standing face to face with the man who had ended Alyssa's life. The trial began, and for the first time, Officer Carlson was forced to face the consequences of his actions. The courtroom was tense as the prosecution presented its case. They called witnesses, presented evidence, and painted a clear picture of how the raid had been a catastrophic mistake, a mistake that had cost a young girl her life. Jeremiah's testimony came next. The entire room fell silent as he took the stand. He had never been the type to speak publicly about his feelings, but in that moment he didn't care about anyone's opinion. He looked straight at the jury and spoke from his heart. "Alyssa was my everything," he began, his voice trembling with emotion. "She was the light of my life. I raised her to believe in justice. I raised her to believe that people who wore badges were supposed to protect us. But they took her from me. They didn't just take my daughter, they took my trust. They took my belief in the system that was supposed to keep us safe." Jeremiah paused, letting his words sink in. He glanced at Officer Carlson, who sat stone-faced, unable to meet his eyes. "This isn't just about a mistake," Jeremiah continued. "This is about the system that allows it to happen. And if we don't do something now, if we don't hold the people responsible accountable, then nothing will change." The room remained quiet as Jeremiah finished his statement, his voice steady but filled with pain. For a moment, there was nothing but silence. It was as if the weight of what he had said hung in the air, heavy with the knowledge that this case was more than just about one officer. It was about a broken system that had failed him. The defense tried to argue that the officer had acted in self-defense, that he had been following orders, but the evidence didn't support that claim. The officers had raided the wrong house, acted on false intelligence, and had no justification for their actions. As the trial continued, more details came to light. The investigation revealed that the officers involved had a history of misconduct, and that the department had failed to act when complaints were made about their behavior. It was a clear case of negligence and racial bias, and the public was outraged. As the trial reached its final days, Jeremiah felt a mix of emotions. He had spent so much time hoping for justice that now, with the verdict only a few days away, he wasn't sure what to expect. But one thing was certain: he would not back down. He had come this far for Alyssa, and he would fight for the truth no matter the outcome. Then the verdict came. The courtroom went quiet as the judge read the decision. "Guilty," the judge said, the word reverberating through the room. Officer Carlson was found guilty of involuntary manslaughter for the death of Alyssa King. Jeremiah sat in stunned silence, his heart racing. He had known that this moment might come, but hearing the word guilty was still overwhelming. It wasn't a perfect victory, but it was a start. Justice had been served. But even as the courtroom erupted in applause, Jeremiah felt a strange emptiness. The verdict wouldn't bring Alyssa back. Nothing could. He had fought for justice, and the victory was sweet, but it was bittersweet. His daughter was gone. No amount of legal battles, no amount of money, could ever fill the hole left in his heart. As he walked out of the courtroom, his shoulders sagging from exhaustion, he was met by the media. Journalists bombarded him with questions, microphones thrust in his face, but he ignored them. The only thing that mattered now was that Alyssa had not died in vain. Her story had reached millions, and it had sparked a conversation that couldn't be ignored any longer. Change was coming, but it was up to people like him, people who had been wronged, to make sure it didn't stop here. Jeremiah didn't know what the future held, but he knew one thing for certain: he would keep fighting, not just for himself, but for every family who had suffered at the hands of an unjust system. As he walked away, he could feel the weight of Alyssa's memory surrounding him, giving him the strength to face whatever came next. Her fight, and his, had just begun.